The Earth had once been a beautiful and vibrant planet, full of life and promise. But everything changed on that fateful day. The sky turned dark with alien ships descending from above, casting huge shadows over the cities. It was a sight no human could have prepared for, and no one understood the full scale of what was happening. These invaders did not come to conquer. They came to wipe out all life, and they succeeded. Lyra had come to Earth on a peaceful mission years before, sent by her people from a faraway star system. Her mission was simple: to observe and learn about humans. She had studied their cultures, their art, and their strange behaviors. She had grown fascinated by the way humans interacted with each other, their creativity, and their unbreakable spirit. But that was before the plague. It started with whispers of a disease that spread like wildfire, moving faster than anyone could track it. It wasn't long before the cities, once filled with the bustling sounds of human life, fell silent. People became sick, then changed. The sickness twisted them, making them something unrecognizable, a monster of flesh and rage. What started as a few isolated outbreaks soon became a global disaster. Lyra watched it all unfold from a distance. She was immune to the plague, her alien biology allowing her to survive where humans perished. But that did not mean she was untouched by the loss. The humans she had studied, the cultures she had admired, were gone. She was alone. The invasion itself had been brutal. The alien ships, massive and imposing, unleashed waves of deadly toxins into the atmosphere, leaving no safe place on Earth. Cities burned. Oceans were poisoned. The air itself became thick and unbreathable in places. The monsters that the plague turned humans into roamed the Earth, hunting anything that remained alive. Lyra's heart ached as she watched the devastation. Her own race had not intended for this to happen, but the effects of the plague were irreversible. She could do nothing but survive. As a small girl when she first arrived on Earth, Lyra had been curious, eager to learn, and to help. Now, all she could do was wander through the empty ruins of cities, the silence a constant reminder of what had been lost. With each passing day, the world around her grew darker and more dangerous. The monsters, twisted by the plague, hunted relentlessly. They were no longer human. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their bodies were grotesque, made more fearsome by the mutations. Some moved on two legs, others crawled on the ground, but all were driven by a single instinct: to hunt and kill. Lyra learned quickly to keep her distance. Her alien abilities made her faster and stronger than any human, but the monsters were relentless, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She would sneak through the remains of the cities, avoiding the creatures, scavenging for food when she could. There were moments when she wished for company, for the companionship of other survivors. But as the days stretched into weeks, then months, she began to wonder if there was anyone else left. The vast emptiness of the world became her prison. The loneliness was unbearable. She had once been surrounded by life, surrounded by the bustling noise of cities, the laughter of humans, the songs of birds, and the hum of the Earth's rhythms. Now there was only silence. Every night, as she sat alone by a fire she had built in the heart of a ruined city, she would look up at the stars, wondering if her people would ever come to rescue her, or if Earth would forever be her prison. But something deep inside Lyra told her not to give up. She couldn't shake the feeling that humanity deserved another chance. They were fragile, yes, but they were also strong. She had seen that strength in their culture, in their will to survive against all odds. And even though the plague had taken so much, she still believed that humanity had the power to rebuild. One morning, while she was walking through the ruins of an old library, she noticed something different. A faint signal flickered in her equipment. It wasn't much, just a static burst, but it was enough to get her attention. The human signal. Lyra's heart raced as she tried to tune it, hoping against hope that it was a sign of life. She quickly gathered her things and set off in the direction of the signal, knowing that this might be the moment she had been waiting for. The possibility that there were other survivors, other humans, was too important to ignore. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a spark of hope. She was no longer completely alone. There were still humans out there, and maybe, just maybe, she could help them rebuild what had been lost. With renewed determination, Lyra set out toward the source of the signal. She had no idea what awaited her, but she knew one thing: Earth was still worth saving, and she was willing to fight for it. Lyra had learned to adapt quickly. The Earth, once teeming with life, had become a place of silence. The cities were nothing but empty shells, crumbling under the weight of time and decay. She wandered the streets of once thriving towns, trying to find something, anything, that would remind her of the world before the plague. But there was nothing. The air was thick with dust, and the only sounds were the distant growls of the monsters roaming the earth. It had been months since the plague had wiped out most of humanity, and Lyra felt the weight of every single day. She missed the sound of voices, the laughter of children, the warmth of human connection. But most of all, she missed the hope that people had once shared with each other. Now, there was only the cold silence of a world without life. Lyra's alien physiology had made her immune to the plague, but it didn't make her invincible. She still had to be cautious. The creatures that had once been human were now wild, unpredictable beasts. They were larger, faster, and more dangerous than anything Lyra had ever seen. The mutation had changed them into monsters that hunted anything they could find. Even Lyra, who was stronger and faster than the average human, had to be careful. She had learned to hide, to blend in with the shadows. The monsters were attracted to movement and noise, and Lyra had no intention of becoming their next meal. She had a few weapons, tools left behind by the humans, which she had scavenged. But her greatest weapon was her mind. She had studied human behavior long enough to understand their patterns. She knew where the monsters liked to hide, and she knew where to find food and supplies. Despite the dangers, Lyra had survived. Each day was a challenge, but she had learned to endure. She scavenged the remains of cities, picking through the rubble for anything that could help her. Food was scarce, but there were always supplies hidden in abandoned stores, and sometimes she was lucky enough to find clean water. She kept moving, never staying in one place for too long. Staying in one spot was dangerous. The monsters were always searching for something to hunt, and a single mistake could lead to disaster. But as the weeks turned into months, the loneliness began to gnaw at her. She had no one to talk to, no one to share her thoughts or fears with, even though she had her mission: to survive, to help if there were any survivors left. There were days when the emptiness felt unbearable. The silence of the world around her was deafening. She could hear the wind whispering through the broken windows of the buildings, and the occasional thud of a distant creature stomping through the streets. But there were no voices, no laughter, no conversations. Lyra missed human voices. She missed the way people interacted with each other, how they found joy even in the smallest things. She missed the idea of community, of working together for a common goal. But most of all, she missed the warmth of human connection. The earth she had once studied, with all its beauty and flaws, was now a barren wasteland. There was no one left to share it with. There were times when Lyra would find herself sitting in the ruins of an old park or a quiet street, staring at the sky. She would think back to the days when she first arrived on Earth, excited to learn about its people and its cultures. She had been so full of hope then, so eager to explore the world and understand its mysteries. But now, she wondered if it had all been in vain. The humans were gone. The cities were empty. And she was alone. But then, there were moments when she remembered what she had seen in the humans. Their resilience, their ability to keep going, no matter how difficult the situation. Even in the darkest times, humans found a way to survive. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the future. Maybe there were other survivors out there, people who were still holding on, just like her. Lyra didn't know if she would ever find anyone. The world had become so vast, and the monsters were so unpredictable. But the thought of finding another human, another survivor, kept her going. It was a small flicker of hope in a world that seemed to have none left. One day, as she was walking through a ruined city, she spotted something unusual. A faint signal, barely noticeable, coming from a nearby radio tower. It was weak, but it was unmistakable. It was human. The signal was a cry for help, a voice calling out from somewhere in the distance. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't the only one left. There were still humans out there. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a rush of excitement. She wasn't alone. There were still people alive. The hope she had almost lost returned in an instant. She didn't know who the voice belonged to or where they were, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to find them. With renewed purpose, Lyra set off toward the signal. She didn't know how long it would take, or what dangers lay ahead. But for the first time in months, she felt alive again. There was still a chance for humanity, and she was going to find it. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she adjusted the settings on the small radio transmitter she had found in the ruins of an old communications tower. The signal was weak but unmistakable, a human voice. She had thought, for so long, that she was the only one left. Yet here was proof that there were others. Her hands trembled slightly as she concentrated, trying to catch more of the transmission. It was distorted, broken, but it was there. The voice was calling for help. The thought that someone else might still be alive filled her with a surge of hope she hadn't felt in months. She could hardly believe it. The world had been silent for so long, but now there was a chance, however small, that she might not be alone. She listened closely, trying to make out the words. The signal faded in and out, but she heard the urgent tone in the voice. It was human. It was real. Lyra knew she couldn't waste any time. She grabbed her supplies, checked her weapons, and set off toward the source of the signal. It was a journey she had made countless times before, moving through the wreckage of a once thriving city, avoiding the mutated creatures that roamed the streets, scavenging for food and water. But this time, she wasn't just surviving. She was searching for someone who could be as desperate as she was, or maybe even more. The road ahead was treacherous. The monsters, always lurking in the shadows, were unpredictable. They were relentless, drawn to movement, to sound. Lyra had learned to move silently, using the quiet to her advantage. She crouched low, her alien instincts guiding her as she made her way through the ruined city, staying out of sight. She kept her senses sharp, aware that any mistake could lead to a deadly encounter. Hours passed as she traveled. The city around her was a maze of crumbling buildings, broken glass, and overgrown streets. It was almost unrecognizable from the bustling place it had once been. Where once there had been laughter and life, now there was only silence and decay. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The sky was gray, as if even the heavens themselves had lost hope for the world below. But despite everything, Lyra felt a glimmer of something deep inside her, a sense of purpose. She was on a mission, and she couldn't afford to fail. She had to find the source of the signal. If there were survivors, it meant there was still hope for Earth, for humanity. The thought of it filled her with determination. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Lyra spotted something in the distance. A figure. At first, she thought it might be one of the monsters. But then she saw the way it moved. Slow, unsteady. It was human. Her heart raced as she approached cautiously, her every sense on alert. She couldn't afford to make any noise. As she neared, the figure grew clearer. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothing, his body bruised and battered. He was clearly struggling to move, his steps slow and uneven. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes seemed lost, as if he didn't know where he was going anymore. He hadn't noticed her yet. Lyra took a deep breath, stepping closer. She had to be careful. She had never met a human survivor before, and she had no idea how they might react. She could have stayed hidden, watched from the shadows, but she couldn't do that. Not now. Not when she was so close. The man stumbled forward, his foot catching on a pile of debris. He fell to his knees, groaning in pain. Lyra's heart ached for him. She had seen enough suffering in the past months to recognize it when she saw it. She moved forward, silently, and knelt beside him. The man's head snapped up at the sound of movement. His eyes widened, fear flashing across his face. Lyra froze, her hand raised in a peaceful gesture. She knew how dangerous humans could be in situations like this. They were desperate, and in their desperation, they might lash out. She didn't want to hurt him. She wanted to help him. "Don't be afraid," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to help." The man stared at her, his breath shallow, his eyes flicking between her face and the ground. He seemed to be trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she real? Was she a monster? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His voice was weak, barely a whisper. Lyra extended her hand toward him, offering help. "I won't hurt you," she repeated gently. "You're safe now." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but it was enough. With Lyra's help, he rose to his feet, swaying slightly, and leaned against the wall of a nearby building for support. He was exhausted, clearly on the brink of collapse. "My name is Isaac," the man said, his voice rough. I didn't think anyone else was alive." Lyra nodded. "I'm Lyra," she said simply. "I'm glad you're here." Isaac looked at her with a mixture of surprise and confusion. "You're not human," he said softly, more to himself than to her. Lyra smiled slightly, though it was a bittersweet expression. "No, I'm not." She could tell that Isaac was still trying to process the situation. He was injured, weak, and scared. But the fact that he had spoken to her, that he had trusted her enough to take her hand, was a sign. He was still human, still full of that strange, stubborn will to survive. And that, Lyra thought, was all that mattered. Isaac leaned heavily against the crumbling wall of the building, trying to catch his breath. His body ached from exhaustion, his muscles sore from days of constant movement, and his mind was filled with confusion. He had seen Lyra's strange appearance and heard her words, but he couldn't fully comprehend it. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen before, yet she had saved him when he was on the verge of collapse. "I didn't think anyone else was alive," Isaac murmured, his voice still weak but more steady than before. He glanced up at Lyra, studying her face. She looked different, but there was something comforting in her eyes, a kind of calm that made him feel less afraid. Lyra nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile. "I know what you mean. I thought the same for a long time. But you're not alone. There are still survivors, and we can help each other." Isaac wasn't sure what to think. The world had fallen apart. The plague had taken almost everything. Cities were empty, and the monsters, those horrible, twisted creatures, roamed freely, hunting whatever they could find. And now here she was, someone who wasn't human, someone who had found him and spoken to him like they were old friends. It didn't make sense. Lyra seemed to understand his confusion. "I know it's hard to believe," she said gently, "but I'm here to help. You don't have to be alone anymore." Isaac was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. His life had been a constant struggle, hiding from the monsters, scavenging for food, and avoiding other survivors who might not be as kind as Lyra. Trust was a rare thing now. It was hard to let anyone close after everything that had happened. But something in Lyra's presence made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could trust her. "So, what now?" Isaac asked, his voice low and uncertain. "We stick together," Lyra replied firmly. "We find other survivors, gather what we can, and figure out a way to rebuild. This world may be broken, but it's not beyond saving." Isaac looked around at the ruins of the city. Buildings that had once been alive with activity were now nothing more than skeletons of their former selves. The streets were empty, the wind howling through shattered windows. It was hard to believe that anything could ever be rebuilt, that life could return to a place so full of death and decay. "I don't know if rebuilding is even possible," Isaac said, shaking his head. "Everything feels lost. How can we fix all this?" Lyra's eyes softened as she stepped closer to him. "We start with one step, one person at a time. If there are survivors left, we find them. We build a community, and even if we can't fix everything, we can make a difference. We can survive together." Isaac stared at her, her words slowly sinking in. He had lived in fear for so long, afraid that he was the last person left on Earth. But here was someone who didn't give up, someone who believed that there was still hope. He couldn't let that belief go so easily. "You really think we can do it?" Isaac asked quietly. "I do," Lyra said with quiet confidence. "I've seen what humans are capable of. I studied you for so long, Isaac. Your strength, your ability to survive. Those things are incredible. I believe you can rebuild." Isaac didn't know if he believed her completely. But for the first time in months, he felt a small spark of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. "I'm with you," Isaac said after a long pause. "I don't know where to start, but I'm not giving up. Not now." Lyra smiled, her expression full of quiet pride. "Good. That's the first step." Together, they set off into the streets, each one of them carrying a little piece of hope. Isaac wasn't sure where they were headed or what challenges lay ahead. But for the first time since the plague had started, he didn't feel entirely alone. He had Lyra beside him, and that made all the difference. As they walked, they talked about what they could do next. Lyra knew the world was dangerous, and that their survival depended on being smart. She explained how they would have to be careful of the mutated creatures that still roamed the city, how they would need to find shelter and food before nightfall. "Monsters still hunt in the dark," Lyra said, her voice steady. "We can't afford to take any chances." Isaac nodded. "I've seen them. I know how dangerous they are." They moved cautiously through the ruined streets, always alert. They passed by old stores, broken homes, and once beautiful parks now overgrown with weeds. It was a world in decay, a world that had once been full of life, but was now ruled by silence. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they found a safe place to rest. It was an old, abandoned building, the remains of a grocery store. There were shelves still standing, though most were empty. The floor was littered with debris, but there was a small corner that looked safe enough to set up camp for the night. Isaac collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved to have a moment of peace. Lyra sat nearby, scanning the area and keeping watch, her sharp eyes constantly on the lookout for any danger. "This is the start," Lyra said softly, looking at Isaac as he sat there. "We've found each other, and that's the first step. There's more to come, but we'll face it together." Isaac nodded, feeling the weight of the day on his shoulders. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of hope. It was a strange feeling, almost foreign, but it was also a feeling he couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. And with that thought, Isaac allowed himself to close his eyes and drift into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing that tomorrow was a new day. The next morning, Lyra and Isaac woke to the sound of distant howls. The monsters were already awake, and the city was alive with their growls and screeches. Isaac sat up, his body sore but his mind sharper. The day ahead was uncertain, and they couldn't afford to waste time. Lyra was already moving, gathering their things, her alien senses sharp and alert. She glanced at Isaac, who was still rubbing sleep from his eyes, and gave him a small smile. "We need to stay focused. We're heading towards the old town square today. It's a good place to find supplies and hopefully more survivors." Isaac nodded. He had learned to trust her instincts, even if he didn't always understand them. She had already shown him that survival in this new world was about more than just being strong. It was about being smart and cautious. The journey to the town square wasn't easy. The city was full of dangers, and Lyra kept her senses trained on every sound. She could hear the creatures moving through the streets, their claws scraping against concrete, and the occasional snarl cutting through the quiet. It was easy to forget the world was once bustling with life, filled with people, noise, and joy. Now, everything felt empty and hollow. They moved quietly, ducking into abandoned buildings whenever they heard the monsters getting too close. Lyra's alien agility and quick thinking kept them out of sight, but Isaac had learned to keep quiet and stay close. The last thing they needed was to attract attention. The path to the town square led them through broken streets lined with crumbling buildings. Every so often, they passed an old store, a park, or a public square that had once been filled with people. Now, it was a ghost town. The streets were overgrown with weeds and vines, and the buildings were empty, hollow shells of their former selves. The silence was deafening. As they neared the square, Lyra signaled for Isaac to stop. She crouched down, scanning the area. "I hear something," she whispered. Isaac held his breath, listening. There was a low growl, distant but growing closer. He could feel his heart racing. He hadn't faced a monster up close since he had met Lyra, and the thought of it still filled him with fear. Lyra motioned for him to stay behind her. "Stay low," she said. "We'll wait until it passes." They waited, hidden behind a half-destroyed wall, their eyes fixed on the narrow street in front of them. The growl grew louder, and Isaac's grip tightened on the improvised weapon he had found, a broken pipe that could at least be used for defense. Then, through the dust and rubble, a monstrous creature appeared. It was taller than any man, with twisted limbs and a grotesque, misshapen face. Its eyes glowed red in the dim light, scanning the area for movement. Lyra held her breath, her body perfectly still. She knew they couldn't outrun it, so staying out of sight was their best chance. The creature sniffed the air, its head moving from side to side. Isaac's heart raced, and he could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down his neck. His hands tightened on the pipe, ready to fight if needed. But after a tense moment, the creature turned and lumbered away, following the scent of something else further down the street. Lyra exhaled quietly, signaling Isaac to follow her. "That was too close," Isaac whispered. Lyra nodded but didn't say anything. They couldn't afford to waste time talking about the danger. They had to keep moving. They continued on, eventually reaching the heart of the town square. It was as empty as the rest of the city, but there was one noticeable difference. There was a small fire burning in the center of the square. It was faint but visible, flickering in the breeze. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she approached cautiously. "Someone's here," she said quietly. "Stay behind me." Isaac followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. Was it another survivor, or had they stumbled into a trap? They didn't know who could be out there, and they couldn't take any chances. As they drew closer, they could make out a small camp by the fire. A figure sat with their back to them, hunched over, their face obscured by a hood. They were cooking something in a pot over the fire, the smell faint but enough to make Isaac's stomach growl. Lyra moved forward, taking slow, careful steps. She wasn't sure what to expect. The figure didn't seem to notice them yet. She raised her hand in a peaceful gesture. "Hello," Lyra called softly. The figure froze. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the person turned around. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. The person was a woman, with short, dark hair and a weathered face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she looked just as tired as they did. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Isaac feel a little less alone. The woman started, her voice hoarse. She stood up quickly, defensive. "Who are you?" Lyra held up her hands, showing she meant no harm. "We're survivors," she said calmly. "We heard the signal. We came to help." The woman eyed them warily, her hand still on a knife at her belt. "You're not the first ones to show up," she said, her voice quiet. "But I'm not sure if I can trust you yet." Isaac stepped forward, trying to ease her concerns. "We just want to help," he said. "We've been alone for so long. We're trying to find other survivors. We want to rebuild, if that's even possible." The woman looked at him, then at Lyra. Her expression softened, but she still kept her distance. "Maybe it's possible," she said, her voice quieter now. "But it's not easy. The monsters are everywhere. And trust doesn't come easy anymore." Lyra nodded. "We understand, but we can help. We have to stick together." The woman considered this for a moment, then slowly lowered the knife. "All right," she said, her tone uncertain. "You can stay for now, but I'll be watching you." Isaac and Lyra exchanged a look. They had found someone, a new ally in a world that felt so empty. And this was just the beginning. The woman's name was Clara. She had lived alone for months, learning to survive in the ruins of the city. When Lyra and Isaac sat around the small fire, Clara carefully prepared a simple meal. The food smelled faintly of herbs and stew, and Isaac's stomach growled loudly in response. It had been days since he had eaten anything other than scraps. Clara didn't speak much while she worked. She was cautious, as if she was still unsure whether she could trust Lyra and Isaac. But after a long silence, she finally broke the quiet. "So," Clara said, stirring the pot, "what's your plan? You're not the first people I've met out here. A lot of people have tried to form groups before. Most of them ended badly." Lyra exchanged a glance with Isaac. She knew Clara's words were true. Trust was something that had to be earned, especially now, in a world where survival often came before anything else. But she also knew that they couldn't survive alone. They needed each other. "We want to rebuild," Lyra said simply. "We've seen what people can do when they work together. It's not going to be easy, but we believe it's possible. The world doesn't have to stay like this." Clara looked up, her eyes searching Lyra's face. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but instead, she simply nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there's still a chance, but I've seen what happens when hope is too much. It gets crushed. I've had my share of loss." Isaac could hear the pain in Clara's voice. He understood what she meant. He had lost so much too. His family, his home, everything he had known. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not now. "What can we do to help?" Isaac asked quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "We can't do this alone. But if we stick together, we might just make it." Clara studied him for a moment, then turned her attention back to the pot. "Well, first things first. You're going to need more than words. You'll need weapons, supplies, and shelter. And we'll need to be prepared for anything. Those monsters aren't the only threat out here." Lyra frowned slightly. She had always been aware of the creatures that roamed the streets, twisted and terrifying. But Clara's words hinted at something darker. There were dangers beyond the monsters. "What do you mean?" Lyra asked. Clara sighed, setting the spoon down. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "It's not just the creatures. Some survivors. They've become worse than the monsters. They'll do anything to survive, even if it means hurting others. They take what they want, and they leave nothing behind." Isaac's stomach tightened. He had heard stories of raiders and bandits, people who had given up their humanity in the name of survival. It was hard to imagine that people, too, could become as dangerous as the monsters that roamed the streets. "Have you encountered them?" Isaac asked. Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, a few months ago, a group of them attacked me. They didn't want my food. They wanted something else." Her voice trailed off, and Isaac could see the pain in her eyes. "I barely escaped with my life." Lyra's expression hardened. She had seen enough violence in her own travels to know how dangerous people could become when they were desperate. But Clara's story made the threat all too real. This world wasn't just full of monsters. It was full of people who had forgotten how to be human. "We'll be careful," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to hurt anyone, but we'll protect ourselves. And if we find others who want to rebuild, we'll help them." Clara studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I hope you're right. I really do." The rest of the meal passed in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Isaac was grateful for the food, but his mind was elsewhere. They had a long road ahead, and he knew there were dangers at every turn. He wasn't sure if they would find more survivors or if they would face even greater challenges. But he knew one thing: he couldn't give up. Not now, when there was finally a chance to rebuild. As the fire began to die down, Lyra stood up. "We need to get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll start looking for supplies. We'll head to the old hospital first. It's a good place to find medical supplies and more food." Clara nodded but didn't stand. "It's a dangerous place. I've heard stories of people who went there and never came back." Lyra's eyes were steady, full of determination. "We can handle it. We'll stick together. If we stay focused, we'll make it." Isaac stood as well, stretching his sore muscles. "We have to try. For all of us." Clara watched them both, her gaze lingering for a moment before she spoke again. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. The hospital might not be the only danger out there." "We'll be ready," Lyra replied, her voice calm but certain. With that, they settled down for the night, the cold air biting at their skin. The fire had almost gone out, but they managed to huddle close for warmth. Isaac's mind raced with thoughts of the future, of what they might find at the hospital, of what dangers still awaited them. But there was one thought that kept him grounded. They were still alive. They had each other. And that was enough. For now. The morning came slowly as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Isaac woke up first, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. But he felt better than he had in days. The quiet morning was peaceful, and for a moment, he let himself forget about the dangers they faced. Clara was already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, her eyes scanning the area with a careful, wary look. She had been a survivor long before Isaac and Lyra came into her life, and her caution was something they had all learned to respect. Lyra stood up next, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. Her alien nature was still a mystery to Isaac, but he had come to trust her completely. She seemed unaffected by the world around them. Always calm, always prepared. She was their leader in a way, even if she didn't see it that way herself. "Ready to go?" Lyra asked, her voice steady. Isaac nodded, his stomach tight with mirrors. Today they were going to the hospital, a place that Clara had warned them about. Isaac didn't know what they would find there, but the promise of medical supplies and more food made the risk feel worth it. They packed their things quickly. Clara had insisted on bringing a weapon, a short, sharp knife, while Isaac carried his broken pipe. Lyra didn't need a weapon. Her skills were enough to keep them safe. "Stay close," Clara warned as they began to walk through the quiet, empty streets. "If anything feels off, we leave immediately. I'm not going to risk my life for some supplies." Lyra and Isaac both nodded, understanding the gravity of Clara's words. They had all learned to trust their instincts in this world, and Clara's instinct for danger had kept her alive for months. They couldn't afford to ignore it. The journey to the hospital was longer than they had expected. The streets were filled with rubble, abandoned vehicles, and the twisted remains of what had once been a vibrant city. The air felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. When they finally reached the hospital, it was clear that it had been abandoned for a long time. The building was covered in vines, the windows shattered, and the front doors were locked and rusted shut. The hospital, once a place of healing, now stood as a hollow monument to the past, but it was still their best hope for finding what they needed. "Any ideas?" Isaac asked, looking at Lyra. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes scanning the building. She motioned for the group to follow her to the side of the building, where there was a small, broken window. "We'll climb through there," she said. It's too dangerous to try the front entrance. Clara looked at the window, skeptical but unwilling to argue. This better work. With a little effort, they managed to squeeze through the broken window, one by one. Inside, the hospital was dark and silent. The air smelled stale, and the faint scent of mold lingered in the corners. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. They moved cautiously through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the empty building. The walls were cracked, the lights long dead, and the once clean floors were now littered with dust and debris. It was like walking through a forgotten world. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest as they moved deeper into the hospital. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant sound made him jump. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of. Was it the monsters that roamed the streets or something else? Something human. Suddenly, they heard a noise. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. It came from somewhere down the hallway. Isaac froze, and Clara held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. Lyra crouched low, her alien senses alert. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "We don't know who or what's in there." The noise grew louder, closer. Isaac's grip tightened on the broken pipe. They had to be ready for anything. The shuffling stopped right around the corner, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tired, disheveled, and holding a makeshift weapon. His eyes were wide with fear, and he seemed just as surprised to see them as they were to see him. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice shaky. Lyra stepped forward slowly, keeping her hands visible to show she meant no harm. "We're survivors," she said. "We're not here to hurt you. We're just looking for supplies." The man eyed them warily, his grip tightening on the weapon. "I don't trust anyone anymore," he said, his voice rough. "The world's not the same. People are dangerous." "We understand," Isaac said, his voice calm. "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need help. We're looking for food, medicine, anything we can find." The man hesitated, then lowered his weapon slightly. "I haven't seen anyone in days," he said quietly. "But the supplies, they're mostly gone. The hospital's been picked clean. There are still a few rooms left, though, if you want to try." Lyra nodded. "Thank you." The man glanced at them one last time before turning to lead the way. "Follow me. But be careful. There are others who might not be as friendly." Isaac followed, his heart heavy with the weight of the warning. He had seen what people could do when they were desperate. This man might not be the only one left in the hospital. They continued deeper into the hospital, moving cautiously through the dark, empty halls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Isaac felt a growing sense of unease, but there was no turning back now. They had come this far. They had to keep going.